Okay, inshallah. Let's get started. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, respected colleagues and guests. Welcome to this month's Ummatics Colloquium. My name is Hannah Aisha and I'm Outreach Coordinator at Ummatics. And as always, we're happy to welcome our returning attendees to this month's discussion, as well as those of us who are joining for the first time. This is, I think, our fourth public colloquium now, alhamdulillah, so it's good to see recurring members of our audience also coming back for each conversation. Thank you all for joining us today, and we're looking forward to the productive discussion ahead, inshallah, with our insightful guest speakers as always. The topic of today's colloquium is print and the Arabo-Islamic Renaissance. Fundamental to any intellectual revival, as is the foundations of the Ummatics project, is access to knowledge. For those interested in the many branches of Islamic thought, access to texts of the past is crucial to understand the depth of the Islamic tradition, derive insights from the ulama of old, and chart a path for the future that is grounded in Islamic scholarship. Yet the many factors that control our access to this knowledge are often overlooked. The Islamic tradition is often conceived of as static and unchanging over the generations, hindered in the modern era perhaps by authoritarianism and the like, but otherwise conveyed as it had been practiced by the four legal schools of thought for centuries. However, this depiction ignores the work of invisible individuals who, through collecting, editing, printing, and transporting, disseminated the literature that today we consider the classical canon of Islamic texts. This is exactly what Professor Ahmed El-Shamsy traces in his book, Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, how editors and print culture transformed an intellectual tradition. Documenting the rediscovery and popularization of classical Islamic works in the Arab world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, he highlights the work of individuals that facilitated the creation of what we consider the major texts of traditional Islamic studies today. He charts how Islamic book culture was affected by everything from changing political dynamics to the funding of libraries and the rise of esotericism. And in particular, he examines how a renaissance in classical literature was intertwined with the development of the printing press and the subsequent transformation of Islamic scholarship and Arabic literature. Professor Ahmed's book was published in 2020 by Princeton University Press and can of course be read in full, but he has kindly submitted an abridged paper on the topic for our colloquium members today, and that he will be presenting for about 25 minutes to start off this discussion. That will be followed by two respondents who will speak for about 10 minutes each, and then inshallah we will open the floor for audience participation. Dr. Ahmed El-Shamsy is a professor of Islamic thought and the department chair of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. He studies the intellectual history of Islam, focusing on the evolution of the classical Islamic disciplines and scholarly culture within their broader historical context. Our first respondent for today is Dr. Omar Anchasi. Dr. Omar is a postdoctoral research fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. His interests include the intellectual history of Islamdom, modern and pre-modern, and include, but are not limited to, Islamic law and legal theory, Kalam theology, and Quranic studies. Our second respondent is Dr. Alex Thurston. Dr. Alex is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Cincinnati. He is the author of Salafism in Nigeria, Islam, Preaching and Politics, published in 2016, Boko Haram, The History of an African Jihadist Movement, published in 2018, and Jihadists of North Africa and the Sahel, Local Politics and Rebel Groups, published in 2020. So we have a lot to get through. Just a reminder of our format for those who are joining us for the first time. People who are in the panel here are our colloquium members who are invited to unmute themselves and pose their questions directly during the Q&A session. But of course, our public attendees can submit their questions in the Q&A box and can also raise their hand in the Q&A session if they would like to submit their questions directly. They can request to unmute themselves and our administrators will facilitate that. More details on that in the actual Q&A session. For now, without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor Ahmed to get us started.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for this introduction. Thank you, Uwaimer and Othman, for inviting me. And thank you very much to Omar El-Shamsy and Alex Thurston for agreeing to engage with my work. Anybody who writes or kind of puts themselves out there knows that that is the kind of most precious thing to get, is people engaging with your ideas, even if it's critical. It's not about whatever, some sort of having one's ego stroked, but rather having people who take your ideas seriously, to engage with them, whether agreeing or disagreeing with you. So thank you all for coming and attending. I know it's the summer, and there are many things that one might want to do in this kind of period, rather than sit and listen to a Zoom lecture, but welcome anyway. So what I wanted to do is, rather than summarizing points or anecdotes or things like this that I write about in my book, and that I partly have given to you in this short paper I've distributed, I wanted to draw together some major themes that I, with hindsight, kind of both from the process of writing this book and from the reactions and the discussions I've had on it, would kind of like to put kind of to discussion. The first one is the overall question of tradition. So, Muhammad Qasim Zaman, in his book, in the Ulama of South Asia, writes about tradition, that it is, quote, quite simply, and then he quotes Alistair McIntyre, an argument extended through time, i.e. it is a continuing, it is not just a static thing, but it is an argument. It is a discussion that takes place over, over and through time. But what I find interesting is that Muhammad Qasim Zaman introduces it by saying quite simply, given that, if you think about the mechanics of having a conversation throughout a civilization over, in the case of Islam, 1,400 years, how exactly would that be taking place? To have a conversation that really, that extends from West Africa all the way to Indonesia, that extends over so many, so that's just east to west, and then north to south, and over so many language communities over such a long period of time. How exactly does this work? And while on the one hand there is for Muslims this there is a legitimate kind of pride in kind of a sense of orality. Muslims memorize the Quran, they memorize hadith, they might be memorizing teaching texts, but really there are very hard limits to what the human mind can memorize. So really, when we're thinking about a continuity of a tradition, a tradition as rich as the Islamic tradition, we're really talking about books. And so how does one even facilitate this continuity over such a long period of time? And so when we think about a tradition, where does this tradition live, right? Where do you find this tradition? Who has this tradition? Right? You see a picture of a man with a turban and a long beard. Does this person have the tradition? What would that mean? Do they represent the tradition? And so, in my own kind of intellectual formation, there were kind of three places where I kind of encountered the kind of written tradition. And the first one was the bookstore. I had a local bookstore in my hometown in Damanhur in Egypt that had wonderful printed books, and I spent hours and hours and days in this bookstore, and I looked at under this category, taking out a book and looking at the introduction. I've never heard of this. This person. When did this person live? Oh, okay. And then looking at the text, and then going on, and kind of getting an idea of the landscape that you're engaging with. But again, that was that was a solitary experience, right? So I was alone in this bookstore and I interacted with these books directly. And I didn't really pay much attention to these editors who had actually edited those texts, even though I read the introductions, right? So they were the ones in a way who introduced me to those texts, but I didn't really think it was something that necessarily I needed to know who these people were. Then the second arena where I encountered the tradition was, in kind of teaching circles at Al-Azhar, with professors teaching in the Al-Azhar Mosque. And obviously, it takes a long time to study a text from cover to cover, right? So it was much slower encounter with these texts. But in a sense, it was more assuring. It was because you had a teacher who knew the text much better than you, right? And very often these texts, these people have an ijazah on this text, right? So it's not just that they went to the bookstore and bought this text, but they have studied the same text with somebody who studied the text, and so on and so on. So they're these teaching texts that Al-Azhar, they really go back to, an Azhari writing that text, 600 years ago, and has been continuously taught in this institution since then. So there's a sense of continuity, but there's also at the same time a sense of this is a more limited corpus of texts that you're encountering there, right? And then when I was a little bit older and I visited a manuscript library for the first time, that was even, a third place where I encountered books. So these were books that had managed to survive physically, that hadn't, I don't know, that you just find, as in hadith studies, it's just wujada, you just find this text, you don't know, has anybody even touched this for 100 years, 500 years, I don't know. In a sense, an orphan, right? If this is a manuscript that hasn't been edited, there's no teacher there who can guide you. There's no editor who has looked at this before. So you're alone with this text, and you're faced with something that was written by hand by somebody a long time ago. And it's not clear why this text was neglected. Maybe it's just trash. Maybe it's wrong, right? Or maybe it's a gem that nobody just has found. So it's a very different kind of, as an individual, you encounter this text and you think, okay, so this is from quote unquote the Islamic tradition, but what is its value, and what does it mean? So part of my part of the process that I went through in writing this book is kind of making sense of these three strands and figuring out how they fit together, in the context of the Islamic intellectual tradition. And I believe that these three different strands represent different ways of how the past has been mediated to us. So the manuscripts, they have just survived. They are just things that have survived, that happen to survive. They didn't burn. They weren't eaten by worms. They weren't dissolved by moisture. But again, this pure survival doesn't say anything about the content. Doesn't say anything about what it means. And then you have these texts that I taught in kind of traditional seminaries that have this continuous change of transmission, which function as a kind of stamp of approval. There's a certain sense of an ideology of continuity there, in the sense that there is a system that teaches, and there's the idea that the tradition preserves what is valuable, right? So if you read a teaching text on whatever, kalam, it gives you, what are the 3 to 5 opinions on predestination that existed throughout the time period, and then it gives you why 4 out of the 5 are wrong and why the 5th is correct, and that's it. You don't need anything more, right? And so that you trust the tradition, that the tradition is kind of preserved what's valuable, and then you are educated with regards to this specific point. But there is a certain sense in which this type of tradition is a closed system, right? If you need to have texts that are continuously transmitted, then once a text falls out of this tradition, it kind of disappears from the radar, right? Okay, one anecdote that really kind of spoke to me when I wrote this book is Muhammad Abdu reads the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun, very famous book, obviously very influential book and very important book, and he wants to teach it at Al-Azhar, right? And Sheikh Al-Azhar tells him, no, we can't teach it here because we don't, we've never taught it before. Right? We haven't taught it before, so we're not going to teach it. So there's a certain sense in which, there's a sense of traditionalism that is not open even to works from the tradition. But once the kind of, you say, well, it hasn't been taught here for, it was written in the 14th century, so it hasn't been taught here for 600 years, or at that point for 550 years. So there must be a reason why it wasn't taught. And we're not going to start. We're not going to question that. It wasn't taught here before, so we're not going to teach it. We're not going to start teaching it. And then the third logic, the third mediation is printed books. And what really struck me there is that this is something in between the kind of traditionalism of the seminaries and just the world of manuscripts, in a sense that there are modern agents. There are people who have edited this text. There are people who have looked at these manuscripts before you have, and they have found these texts to be valuable for some reason. Right? There can be different reasons, but they found a reason to take this manuscript and to edit it and to publish it, and so there is an agenda of somebody who is close to you in time that this text is serving, and so there's different agendas, and that's part of my interest and my research in this book of agendas, why specific books were worthy of this attention of editing them and printing them. And so the first point to stress here is that print in the Islamic world is really a 19th century phenomenon, in which the modernizing states use this tool to begin with to promote schooling, to facilitate mass schooling, right? So you have mass production of books for the mass production of students. With that, you have the rise of literacy, and for that you need to have specific, textbooks for Arabic language. You need to have histories. Like if you want to build a state, you need to have a history of that state, something like this. You need to have literature. And the more the society becomes literate, the more it becomes, the more demand there is for more books, right? So if literature moves from simply the relatively small group of ulama, of scholars, and becomes widespread, more and more people are interested in reading books. And of course, there are books that are written recently, there are books that are translated, but there's also an interest in classical works. And so there is a market, there is private presses who want to make money with this. And so in terms of the agendas that are served by print is you have all kind of agendas that pop up in the 19th century and the early 20th century. There is, as I said, education, there is entertainment, there is something like internal critique. As I mentioned before, kind of a pure traditionalist approach to the Islamic intellectual tradition is a closed system that therefore also has limited capacity to critique itself, right? While if you disagree with the current state of your religious tradition, what do you do if you're a pure traditionalist? It's very difficult. You can kind of break out of the Islamic tradition altogether and whatever, read French philosophy, something like this. Or alternatively, you might look at books that have fallen out of the tradition, older works that actually disagree with this current kind of mainstream opinions. And so in that sense, rediscovering old Islamic books might be a radical thing, right? A radical thing by means of which you can critique the current state of religiosity in your time period. And one of the hot topics was specific kind of popular religions, shrine visitation, etc. That was a big deal in the 19th and early 20th century, and rediscovery of older works that were very critical of this was something that really animated a lot of discussions at the time. So rediscovering kind of previously marginalized works served that role. A further point that I want to make in this book is, apart from kind of pointing out agendas that led to the publishing of specific books, to talk a little bit of the mechanics of editing books. So how do you get from a manuscript to a printed book? And the reason why I think this is important is, on the one hand, I think in order to kind of to raise the standard of Islamic intellectual thought among Muslims and non-Muslims alike, is that we really learn to appreciate the scholarship and the intellectual work that goes into editing a text. You know, if you look at the European intellectual tradition, you know, Erasmus of Rotterdam, for example, in the 16th century, is considered to be a seminal intellectual figure. What did he do? I mean, probably his greatest contribution was the first edition of the Gospels in its original Greek. So he was an editor, right? In the European intellectual tradition, that is considered to be you know, a pinnacle of intellectual engagement. But you know, we hardly even know who these Arab editors were who have given us so much of the intellectual tradition. So kind of setting a monument to these achievements is very important for me, in order to appreciate kind of Islamic intellectual tradition, and not fall into this hole of saying, oh well, whatever, you know, Suyuti was a great scholar, but you know, what has happened ever since? Secondly, I think if you learn about this, it allows you, and it certainly allowed me, to read critically the kind of printed books, Arabic books, that you encounter. You suddenly kind of have a better idea of for example, which editions, like, you know, you have the same book and you find them published in different places by different publishers, but that you very quickly are able to just leaf through it and see, well, is this a good edition or not? You know, what about the introduction? Does the editor talk about the manuscripts that they've used? Do they have footnotes? Do they have a critical apparatus? What is this? What is a critical apparatus? You know, did they use one manuscript? Did they use 5? How did they choose to use which manuscripts to use? Once you kind of get into the problems that these people faced, I think it is much easier to be kind of an informed reader and person who engages with these texts. And it also kind of allows you to understand why, you know, the editions of the same text can actually differ quite dramatically that you encounter. Now, kind of finally, and kind of importantly, for me, what the book does, and this is not something that I really started out with, but in terms of the responses I've gotten from people who've read this book, that seems to have been in the you know, kind of been very in the fore of people's minds when they read this book, is the kind of its contribution to a kind of historical narrative about Islamic intellectual history. You know, to kind of simplify things, you know, there are kind of 2 main narratives about this. There is a kind of a Western modernist narrative in which, according to which, Islam kind of used to be relatively advanced in its so-called golden age, whenever that was, you know, I don't know, maybe Abbasid era or something like this, but then kind of turned decadent in later centuries. And then kind of the Muslim world was, in a sense, revived by by an infusion of modernity, which kind of equals Western ideas and Western thought. And then you have some sort of a counter narrative that is kind of quite similar both among Muslim traditionalists and kind of Western decolonial thinkers, according to which, in fact, things were fine, or were not bad, were not problematic before, in the pre-modern world. But then you had the phenomenon of colonialism, i.e., of Western political, military, economic domination over Muslims. And then you had a phenomenon of Muslim kind of collaborators, intellectual collaborators, modernists, who then came up with a theory to justify European domination and colonialism by criticizing traditional Islam and by talking about Islamic decadence. And so, in fact, there was no problem. What modernists criticized as problems were kind of pseudo problems in order to justify Western domination. Now, what I see, with hindsight, what I see my contribution to be is to kind of to complicate these two models. On the one hand, that modernity in the Islamic world is not simply an infusion of Western technology and Western ideas, but that in fact it also included a widening of the Islamic intellectual horizon. I don't know, there's some sirens outside, I don't know what it is. Widening of the Islamic intellectual horizon. I mean, through the potential of print that allowed Muslims to, and this is really an important point, that it allows people to take even a single surviving manuscript and within a few months, maybe a year's time, to produce thousands of copies, and at the same time to have the economic structure that allows these copies then to be distributed widely, and to have the education among the population of them to actually read the stuff. So you can have a book that is basically orphaned and unknown, even though it exists and it was in fact written, whatever, 1,000 years ago, but it has no impact, it has no reception, and within a relatively short time, it can both be physically reproduced and it can be read by a large percent of the population that is now literate. And so modernity has an indigenous logic that is not just a Western logic, but that is an indigenously Islamic logic of rediscovery. While at the same time, what this logic does is it creates a problem of authority of texts. Right. This is not unique in the sense of, if you look at let's say about the debate between Sunnis and Shiite or Imami Shiites at least, right? Authority has always been a problem, right? Imami Shiites will always say, well, what is your problem is like, so what is correct, right? At least we have an Imam. The Imam always knows what's correct, or if the Imam isn't present, then we have his representatives basically. But kind of a traditional Sunni problem is, so what, like if there is no infallible interpreter anymore, what actually does serve as the kind of authoritative guide, right? And this is multiplied through this technology of print and the availability of books and mass literacy. So we have all those texts, and now with digitization, you can basically find most texts that only used to exist in libraries. You can find online if you just Google them in Arabic. But what do these texts mean, and how can Muslims decide what they mean in an absence of an authority structure? So these are kind of universally modern problems anyway, right? Problems of authority that are also not new to Islam. It's not like in let's say in the case of Catholicism, where you had a very rigid structure that now through modernity becomes questioned quite significantly. You already had this problem in Sunnism much stronger before, but it really becomes exacerbated through these modern logics of print. And when I say print, I don't just mean the technology of print, but things that go with it. As I said, modern libraries, literacy, etc., etc. But
Dr. Ahmed,
so,
you have just
yes.
2 minutes if you're nearing the end.
I've come to the end now. So these are the kind of overall questions and issues that I wanted to raise, and I very much look forward to your comments, Omar and Alex, and the questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed, and thank you for being so punctual. We'll go then, inshallah, to our first respondent, Dr. Omar. Inshallah, the floor is yours.
Thanks. I may not be as punctual as Ahmed. I'll do my best. And I should begin with an apology, which is that my take on this book, like my take on most things, is high or will be highly idiosyncratic and also somewhat partisan. So I've prepared some remarks. And I want to begin very briefly by just riffing off this final point Ahmed made about scholarly narratives. I do think humans are very much creatures of narrative, and that equation includes scholars as well. And I don't really think it's something that it's really possible for us to escape, because the alternative to a narrative is history is a series of one done thing after another. And certainly the book and the paper Ahmed based on it tell a really good and compelling and well-documented story. And I think our responsibility as scholars is not to avoid narrativizing, but to make sure that the narratives we do put forward are empirically grounded ones. So in my response, I want to make 3 kind of key comments. And these especially reflect the fact that this is a Muslim audience, or it's a Muslim forum, and the audience is largely a Muslim one. Obviously, in engaging with the book, it's kind of hard to not have one's religious convictions at the forefront of that engagement, or at least certainly that's how I experienced the book. So firstly, I want to say that based on the kind of diction and vocabulary of the paper and also Ahmed's book, whether it's a reference to limited chronological horizons or narrow curricula. In the book, Professor El-Shamsy also makes reference to the word cleverness quite a lot, which I think characterizes it really well. I think there's, and I have to be careful not to vulgarize what the author is saying, but there is to some extent, I think, a value judgment about the post-classical scholarly tradition, and post-classical being defined as this period between the 16th and 19th centuries. And in some sense, this is why the book has proven to be quite divisive and even polarizing. It's a value judgment not just about the post-classical scholarly tradition in and of itself, but really its significance in relation to the classical literature that it eclipsed. And even the language of Renaissance, one can argue, or Nahdan, this translation of this term, one can argue is a heavily freighted term. It has very positive valence. So again, I may be misrepresenting the author. This is, I'm solely responsible for this interpretation of the book. Now, for my first point, I don't want to actually criticize that value judgment. I want to endorse it, and endorse it very strongly. I would agree with Professor El-Shamsy that it's a wonderful thing that Arabic reading students today, whether in the Muslim majority world or in an academic context in the Western world, are introduced to Islamic civilization through works like Tabari's Tafsir or Maturidi's Kitab al-Tawheed, or Shafi'i's Kitab al-Ummah, what have you. I mean, though it's not popular or fashionable, given current academic trends to say so, I find it extremely hard to value, Hashia number 324 on Baydawi's tafsir as much as a work like, say, the Qadi Abdul Jabbar's Tanzih al-Quran al-Wata'an, where he kind of goes through the Quran systematically in response to all kinds of criticisms of it. And I take that to be self-evident, more or less. I also think it's a mistake to suggest, as one commonly finds in the scholarly literature, that pre-modern Muslim authors did not operate with notions of originality or creativity or even plagiarism, contentions that often guide the scholarship on the subject. Though they won't have used those terms or their equivalents in ways that are coterminous with our uses of those terms, I do think the evidence for analogs to such concepts is too good to disregard. In other words, we hardly need to step outside the Muslim literary tradition in order to mount such critiques of the post-classical heritage, even if such a recourse might make our criticisms more pointed. Sorry. So now I'm not saying, and this is a mistake the author clearly avoids making, that the post-classical scholarly tradition is not deserving of serious scholarship. And he gratefully acknowledges his indebtedness to this body of scholarship. But some criticisms of the book have emanated, precisely from this, from specialists in this domain. Now, it's ironic in this regard to see how works criticizing directly and indirectly the theses of the author have actually lent support to his findings. For example, the mainstreaming of esoteric intellectual pursuits like letterism, astrology, and alchemy has now been widely demonstrated in the literature. So, many people taking issue with aspects of the book and its characterization of the post-classical scholarly tradition themselves would acknowledge that esotericism is just, a fundamental, aspect of this post-classical tradition. And, one could say similar things for the literature of commentary and super commentary and so on. So that's the first point, really, about how one characterizes and interacts with the post-classical scholarly tradition. My second point is really about the, what you can call the classicizing, in inverted commas, approach to the study of intellectual history. And I'm referring to something quite different here. So there's an approach that has historically dominated our field. And I'm not being original here. This is a criticism that others have made as well. And I think Ahmed makes well in this book. There's been a tendency to treat Islamic societies and Islamic intellectual history as though it's somehow dead, ignoring the fact that Muslims presently constitute about a quarter of the human race. And I think related to this approach is, the criticism that it's very easy to make. It's very easy for an academic to criticize the editions of texts produced in the Muslim majority world, critical editions, as unscientific or unscholarly. And of course, everyone would recognize the value that, Orientalist scholarship in the classical mold has made to the production of good editions of texts. But on the other hand, were one to adopt this approach to the edition of texts, we would have only a tiny corpus of printed works to work with. And Ahmed refers in his paper to the breathless urgency guiding the publication of such works in the Muslim majority world, in this era of editing and printing and so on. And I think we do really well to remember this kind of sense of urgency. I think it's worth restating that for a huge number of people in the world, Islamic studies is not an endeavor that ends when one closes the office door in the evening. And for many people, Islamic studies is not a kind of trivial intellectual game or a means for earning a living, or not simply a means for earning a living, but it has real meaning and significance for their lives, and I should say for our lives, because I would certainly characterize myself in this way. You know, in that sense, this Ahmed's book is very helpful in allowing us to recognize the scale of the contribution of this, you know, hitherto anonymous and poorly understood and very varied class of editors and manuscript hunters whom for me really emerge as the kind of heroes of the narrative, and deservedly so. You know, our scholarship is dependent on these editions and the people making them and producing them. And as Professor El-Shamsy points out, you know, the exercise of editing has largely been abandoned in the Euro-American Academy today, with the exception of just a few scholars. And anyone who's worked with a good edition knows that, you know, such a work is, you know, is really a demanding and very scholarly task. But outside of very large externally funded research projects, it's not really possible to pursue these kinds of things, whether it's editing manuscripts or even more so, the kinds of works that are foundational to the discipline, whether it's Brockelman and Sisgen and so on. You know, if you're pursuing tenure and so on, it's not really possible to contemplate such a work unless one is, you know, externally funded. And to that extent, the work, I think, helps bring home the extent to which, you know, Muslims ought to be recognized, you know, even those outside the Western Academy, as living interlocutors who, gosh darn it, might actually have something useful to say or contribute. So that's the kind of second point I want to make about this classicizing approach to the study of Muslim societies and intellectual history. The third point I want to make before concluding is that, you know, criticism of this book, as Ahmed has already suggested, and particularly in a Muslim context, has tended to come from a particular kind of reader, or readers with a particular kind of set of commitments to the Islamic scholarly tradition. To me, one of the great virtues of this work is that it holds up a mirror to that post-classical scholarly tradition. And admittedly, some people are loath to be reminded of exactly what it is that tradition they're committed to defending looks like. Their vision of that post-classical tradition may be one that is selective and highly sanitized, you know, whether it involves, you know, in reality, the excesses of Sufi sheikhs or tomb veneration, or things that students of that period know are, you know, fundamental to the piety and scholarly culture of the post-classical. You know, Ahmed mentions this anecdote of Abdul Ghani al-Nabulsi, where a Sufi kind of falls into a river or a body of water because he prays to God directly instead of addressing God through his Sufi sheikh. And his sheikh disciplines him by reminding him that, you know, you can't pray to God directly. You're not ready for that level yet. You're not spiritually equipped to deal with direct, unmediated prayer to God. Now, I remember when I I read that passage, it made me extremely angry. Not at the author, whom so many readers of the book are mistakenly angry at, but at that you know, particular vision of, you know, whether it's Sufism or anything else that flourished in the post-classical period. And such stories and anecdotes and materials are legion. You know, it's not that this is an unrepresentative example or that it's somehow defamatory. You know, this is commonly encountered by readers of these texts. And I think it behooves such people who are invested in that particular version of the Islamic tradition not to disregard or ignore these kinds of materials, but to address them seriously and in a sober fashion. And they may find they emerge from this exercise with a great deal more sympathy for figures like Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida than they previously did. And finally, to conclude, I think this book tells us that it's a serious mistake to take the rediscovery and publication in printed form of the Islamic heritage for granted. In the book, it's really a labor of love. And undoubtedly, you know, when Ahmed is discussing the actual mechanics of the recovery and publication and funding of these texts, it's not just a labor of love, but you know, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into this process. And you know, certainly my scholarship and the scholarship of many other people simply would not be possible without that labor. So you know, as a parting thought, I would say this book is, or at least should be, one that helps us to cultivate a proper scholarly humility. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omar, for starting us off. And yeah, I think you kept time as well quite well, alhamdulillah. We will as well come back to you, Professor Ahmed, to give you a chance to respond to both of the respondents. But first, we'll hear from Dr. Alex. So when you're ready, inshallah, Dr. Alex.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين. So thanks so much for this opportunity, and you know, really enjoying the discussion so far. I mean, you know, let me start by saying I think this is, you know, really an amazing book, mashallah, and you know, one that I will be keeping on my shelf for the rest of my career, inshallah. I mean, I think it's, you know, not only a model of, you know, erudition and intellectual history, but I think it demarcates really a new area of inquiry. And I really expect and hope, inshallah, that there will be other works that sort of follow in this path and you know, pick up some of the threads and you know, other possibilities for exploration that the book contains. And I think, you know, I read a lot of anthropology, I read a lot of political science. I think that a lot of, you know, social scientists who work on the contemporary Muslim world are aware in a broad way of the kind of transformations that have been wrought by these two factors that Professor El-Shamsy alluded to, you know, several times, this mass availability of printed works and then mass education. I mean, that, you know, references to that recur through political science and through anthropology. But I think the allusions to that are often quite vague. And so, you know, the value of this book lies in part in you know, really tracing how did it get from A to B, you know, and you know, as Professor Shamsi said, the mechanics of putting together, you know, texts, printed texts, and I want to come back to that because I have a question or two on that. But first, I guess, you know, my own sort of orientation. I mean, I think I'm a bit in the middle, and I thought that, you know, Professor El-Shamsi did a nice job, you know, sort of laying out the stakes of this kind of decline debate, and I think that, you know, as you said, we're all sort of creatures of narrative, and I think this is, you know, it's an inherently political question, and how one feels about the post-classical tradition, it doesn't necessarily determine where you stand on you know, in the landscape of contemporary Islamic movements, but it's going to be one key factor in determining your orientation. I mean, it's a huge question. There's a lot at stake, you know, with this assessment of the vitality of the post-classical tradition. So I guess for me, I think I'm a bit in the middle. I mean, not to both sides it, but I'm kind of a, you know, a soft supporter of the argument that the post-classical tradition had some serious vitality to it. You know, I still consider myself a beginner within the study of fiqh and so forth, but for the past few years, I've been reading through, you know, some core texts within the Maliki madhab, and I have found the post-classical commentaries very useful, you know, very readable, key for explaining texts that aren't necessarily, you know, super transparent. You know, for example, the Risala within the Maliki tradition, I think a lot of, you know, Arabic readers could pick up the Risala and read it cover to cover without a commentary. The Mukhtasar of Khalil, you know, central text within the madhab, that's going to be very difficult for somebody to read without a commentary. And you know, the commentary that I'm reading now, again, you know, pretty clear. The author, you know, seems to have had, this is the author is Salih al-Abi, who was an Asari sheikh who died around 1916, 1917 maybe. refers to a lot of literature. I was thinking about this during the presentation and reading the book. I mean, it's unclear exactly what text he had in front of him, at least just looking at the commentary itself, but refers to dozens of other authors, seems to have had, some access. And I found that in commentaries from before the era of print too, that authors do seem to have had a lot of texts in front of them, classical and post-classical, or at least they felt confident making statements about what was in the Mudawwana of Imam Malik or something like that, whether or not maybe they had it in front of them. And I think, a lot of attendees and panelists, I'm sure, are aware of this argument, but I think it's worth restating it in case anybody hasn't heard it, that I think Mohammed Fadl lays it out really nicely in an article of his, I think from 1996, about the social logic of taqlid, that something like the Mukhtasar, 14th century text, was meant to offer a certain level of predictability and standardization. It wasn't necessarily meant, I think, to close the door to further thought, but it was meant to be, a core text. And what it gained in terms of, terseness facilitated memorization, facilitated transmission, but then lost a great deal of clarity, right? So then it requires commentary to expand upon it. And so it's kind of the value of it lies in its terseness, but then it also basically requires text other than itself. And I don't know. I find the post-classical tradition has really a fair amount to offer. I think also another sign of that vitality is, I've spent a certain amount of time now listening to some of the most prominent, contemporary Maliki, ulama, and they seem to take a really additive approach, even ones who are critical of some of the positions within the madhab, even the positions within Khalil's Mukhtasar. So, the Moroccan Sheikh Said al-Kamali, who's had a huge series on the Muwatta that I think he paused during the pandemic, but and then Sadiq al-Ghariani of Libya have been the main two ones that I've listened to. Both of them draw heavily on both classical and post-classical texts, and don't necessarily seem to see a conflict or something like that. And I think that if they found no utility in the the post-classical text, that would have been sidelined. But I think that it's interesting. The approach has been, again, additive instead of just returning to the classical text. Even in Kamali's series on the Muwatta, the core is the Muwatta, and he cites the Sahihain all the time. But then is constantly pivoting back to, again, post-classical Maliki texts, versified law manuals and so forth. And so I think that is a sign, again, that the post-classical tradition has a lot of appeal and still a lot of intellectual value, even in an era where there's this mass access to the classical tradition. And the reason I say that I'm kind of in the middle on this, I think that, that does not mean I think that there has to be some sort of uncritical embrace of the post-classical tradition. I think that, some of the critiques obviously, really land. I think that, and I don't think, I mean, maybe this is sort of the ultimate point. I don't think that all of the solutions that contemporary Muslims, all of the solutions to problems that contemporary Muslims face, I don't think all those solutions can be found in the Sunni tradition. And I think sometimes there is value to bypassing that tradition and going back to the sources and to classical works. And I think that sometimes there's value in rereading the sources to come up with completely fresh interpretations, as long as those are faithful to the sources, inshallah. So I think that there's some middle ground between kind of a negative assessment of the post-classical tradition and then an uncritical embrace of it. Maybe I'll use just the rest of my time to put a couple of questions on the table, and then if there's time for Professor Shamsi to answer them, then great. And if not, I'll at least throw them out there for discussion. I guess the main question I have is to continue, and there's a lot about this in the book, but I'd be interested in going even further, in terms of what are the impacts of these transformations in print and publishing on how Muslims read now. In particular, I'd be very curious to hear more from Professor Shamsi about the impact of the footnote. I think, to me, the most interesting part of the entire book was a section on page 214. I have it in front of me, about Sheikh Al-Kawthari, may God have mercy on him, who, let me quote straight from the book here, that when he published a text of, I want to say Al-Dhahabi, yeah, okay. So, and then this, unfortunately for Al-Kawthari, the rest of Al-Dhahabi's text beyond this paragraph espouses ideas that Al-Kawthari found deeply offensive, causing him to fight a running battle with the author in his editorial footnotes to either refute or simply gainsay him. I think this is hugely important. I mean, I think that footnotes really, really affect how we read now and how we understand text. I mean, the most obvious example to me, just in the things that I read, is the takhrij of a hadith. I mean, almost any book that I look at now has a Sheikh al-Albani's takhrij of the hadith in it. I think this, may Allah have mercy on him. I think that, this really affects, I think, notions of authenticity. I mean, for example, if you pick up, any text, I mean, the Ihya or anything, you're going to find a takhrij of the hadith in it, right? And this could affect, really profoundly how you engage with the text and what you make of it. But I imagine there's other examples of how footnotes shape our experience of texts. And then maybe, I don't want to run out of time, so I'll just put one other question on the table. Is question to Professor Shamsi. Could you say something about the relationship between the publishing boom and the advent of print and then the Salafi movement? Because at times it almost felt in the book like the stage was being set for the entrance of a Sheikh al-Albani. I mean, the Dahiriya library, the mass availability of printed texts, it really felt like this is the next part of, I mean, not that he's the only figure, but he was the most obvious one to me in terms of somebody whose career was shaped and enabled by precisely the kinds of transformations you described. So I'd be curious to hear about, your take on what all this means for our understanding of the trajectory of the Salafi movement, and any other movements that you think were profoundly affected by the advent of print. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alex, and for posing these questions as well to start off our conversation. Professor Ahmed, we can come to you, inshallah, to respond generally to any of the points made by Dr. Omar or Dr. Alex, and then respond to those two questions as well.
Thank you, Omar and Alex, for your comments, your generous comments and your questions. And to start with Omar's observation about value judgments, and I mean, there are certain ways in which, that's obviously not why I set out or how I set out to write this book, but there are certain ways in which you can't quite, like as a let's say you encounter the widespread use of let's say things like inspiration, ilham, as an argument, right? I mean, obviously inspiration, anybody has, we all have whatever forms of dreams or whatever, but to actually use this as an argument in scholarly interaction, right? That's a different thing, right? If I put in my footnotes, the reason for this is that I dreamt last night that the Prophet told me that's correct. I mean, that wouldn't be an acceptable. I mean, I don't think it would be acceptable if I did this to Muslims. They would think that that's kind of unacceptable. Except if I had built up, my credentials through miracle work or whatever. But otherwise, people would think that's a very strange thing to say. But to say that, I mean, to juxtapose that, okay, traditional Muslims take that epistemology to be valid, and then modern Muslims and Westernized people reject that. That is problematic, because when you look at classical works, they are criticizing that as well, right? They say, okay, ilham might be right, it might be wrong, but in scholarly interaction, it's not an argument because we can't check it, right? You need to, so in that, in that sense, to say that, well, there is a certain way in which I cannot defend these esotericisms because I don't believe, like, my very practice, my very identity, and my very work is based on the fact that that is not an acceptable methodology. So I cannot try to kind of romanticize it or whatever and say, oh, well, that is, in a sense, it's kind of orientalizing these people, like, oh yeah, for them it was okay, and I like the idea of some people sitting, wearing traditional clothing and having inspirations. That's very nice. But in the sense of, just kind of, I mean, in that sense, I couldn't extricate myself from that discussion. To Alex, the point about, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, I do not mean to make this a kind of, kind of a blanket statement about the post-classical intellectual tradition. I'm trying to kind of, in the sense that, you can talk about contemporary academia, about, dominant trends, kind of, shall we say, anti-positivist. Let's say you can say contemporary humanities and social sciences are anti-positivist. That doesn't necessarily, it doesn't mean that there isn't, that this covers everything or you can't find anything else in it. But to the question of, who read what, I mean, that is something that really fascinated me. And, there's a lot of material that I haven't put in the book. Some research I did recently was the question of, Al-Alusi's 19th century, like the last great Ottoman tafsir. I looked at, the question in a later study, which I haven't published yet. Did Al-Alusi read at-Tabari's tafsir? And I've come to the conclusion that he didn't. He either read it secondhand through As-Suyuti's tafsir, or he read it thirdhand through Abu Hayyan al-Granati. But he didn't have a Tabari's tafsir at hand. So he cites a Tabari, but he only cites them through other people, right? And that is a difference in the sense of the tradition obviously is not, I mean, like, people are not ignorant of, Al-Ghazali or whatever, Tabari or Ibn Taymiyyah, whatever. They know them. But the point is that many of them never saw their actual books. They only were aware of certain citations, right? So it's a difference between you having read Shakespeare and you knowing a line or two, right? That is, or a couple of citations, but you actually don't know the whole thing. You don't know what a play is or something. You just know some citations. So that's something, again, as you say, this is not, my book is not meant to be the last word, but with many respects, I hope it's going to be the first word in many further studies. And just as a, as I say in the book, one of the things that really struck me, and that was already in grad school when I encountered this letter exchange between Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida, where they're trying to find a copy of the Mudawwana of Sahnun, and there's no copy in Egypt, and they can't find a copy in Syria, and they can't find a copy in Tunisia, and they have to write to the king of Morocco, right, to lend them their copy. And to that really kind of really struck me. I mean, like, really, like, what, I have that in my, I have a copy at home. Muhammad Abdu couldn't find a copy in Egypt, and in the whole Mashriq. I mean, that was the first time when I was thinking, wait a second, what is the tradition even, right? If even a book that in my mind is so central wasn't even available to people, exactly what has happened in the meantime? To the question of footnotes, I think that is really interesting. That in traditional Muslim manuscript culture, there were no footnotes, right? There were marginal notes, and the word hashia comes partially from that, right? People wrote notes on the margins, and that then became part of the book. When people copied the book, they didn't just copy the main text; they also copied the marginalia. So in a way, that the hashia commentary tradition morphed into a footnote tradition. In a sense, of course, modern commentaries are less ornate. Like the partly, the change is not that there's no commentary anymore, but that the commentary has changed. That in the kind of post-classical period, you had all kind of forms of analysis, logic, rhetorical analysis, sometimes going to absolute extremes, which made it unreadable. But we do have footnotes that quasi function as commentaries. And given that Uwaymir is present, let me use that opportunity to give this anecdote. I grew up in a house with a copy of the Madarij al-Salikin of Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya, and it's from a Salafi publisher, and it's fascinating to look at the footnotes, because the editor starts out with praising Ibn al-Qayyim and saying he's the greatest and whatever, but clearly under the impression that this book is going to be a refutation of Sufism in general. But as the book progresses, in the footnotes, he gets more and more annoyed with Ibn al-Qayyim, and it morphs into a refutation of Ibn al-Qayyim. So it's a fascinating kind of process. You can see this editor clearly, oh yeah, Ibn al-Qayyim, he's this great Salafi scholar. I know what he's going to say. He's going to refute those people, and then getting more and more upset with him in the footnotes. So it's not like footnotes are not a genre. Like they are a place in which the editor brings themselves in, and so there's very different kinds of footnotes, right? There's this takhrij, there are these takhrij monsters, right, where there's a book that is like 2 volumes, and then you see it republished, and oh, it's 8 volumes. Did they find more material? Fascinating. And then you get it, and it's like, oh no, every page like has 2 lines of the original text, and the rest is takhrij. It's a kind of, when I look at digital database like al-Maktaba Shamila, I can find all this information about this hadith or this verse or whatever, or this person, and I put all of this in all this information dump in this footnote, so I create this giant text. That of course, that sometimes is just information overload. But yeah, so I haven't developed a kind of a classification of footnotes as different kinds of genre. And your question about Salafism, I mean, my book kind of ends with World War II. So Salafism is a very different animal pre-World War II, and it's kind of misleading even to use the word Salafism. That's why I kind of do avoid it, because it kind of gives you the wrong image. But particularly somebody like Al-Albani, it's fascinating that something that I only found out recently. He did so much work in the Zahiriya library, and what he did was this manuscript library had this thing called a dasht, which is kind of loose pages, like all the loose manuscript pages that weren't part of any book, like the fallout, the books that had disintegrated and the pages that had fallen out of books that were just stored there in a pile. And he spent so many years in this, sorting out, like reconstructing whole books, like Masail of Ahmed ibn Hanbal. So many of these manuscripts Al-Albani actually put together from this giant pile, like rooms of piles of pages that Albani were like, okay, this belongs to this book and this belongs to this book. And a lot of these Masail works of Ahmed ibn Hanbal that were published later by other people were in fact based on Albani putting that stuff together and finding this. And in fact, in the Zahiriya catalog, there is a specific symbol, I think it says Nasir or something like this. That is the symbol of, oh, that manuscript actually was put together by Al-Albani when looking through these loose pages. So there's a lot of stories, that just hasn't been told, and that can be still investigated. And I as I said, I don't want to close this door. I don't want to pretend that I've finished the topic, but rather to kind of when you read a book, when you read a classical book, I don't know, let me just when you read a classical book, then do keep an eye out on these editors, right, and check out what they are, and what they did, etc. Keep an eye out on this. They are not just the service providers, but they are scholars in their own right. They have done their own stuff, right? So yeah, I don't know whether I answered your question, but I found them very rich. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ahmed, and to all of our presenters today. And on that note, inshallah, we'll bring in the audience and open the floor to questions and comments. We're especially looking forward to the contributions of our Colloquium members. So please feel free to raise your hand and then unmute yourselves if you wish to make a comment or pose a question. And for the sake of time, we ask that keep your questions concise, please, to a maximum hard stop of about 2 minutes. To the audience members as well, you can submit your questions in the Q&A box, which I've seen some people have already submitted a couple of questions, and we will endeavour to answer as many as we can within our time. You can also request to unmute yourself and pose your question directly. And again, keep them concise to about 2 minutes, if that's okay. So we'll start with, I think, Brother Yahya. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Professor Shamsi, for a wonderful presentation, and thank you for the responses of Alex and Omar. I have a really unfair question because it's not really, it's a follow-on from your book rather than about the book itself. But if we look comparatively and we think about the introduction of print in Europe, in the 15th century. And at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century, we have the introduction of the internet and the beginning of digital culture. And so we have a long stretch of time there, 500 years, for print culture to work its way through the entirety of European, and then, and wherever print was introduced over a longer period of time or a shorter period of time. But here you're describing, a period of time that's less than 100 years ago. But we're already in the middle of the digital revolution. So what do you think that compression will mean for our ideas around what is the tradition and what is, I guess, what scholarship will be and how it's constructed? I know we're in the early days of this digital revolution, but is there any significance to the compression that the Arab-Islamic world experienced compared to, say, Europe? And it's a general question to the panel, as well as Professor Shamsi.
Yeah, so I mean, the compression is both in terms of the time, right? So print in Cairo started really 200 years ago now, but it's also much more material was compressed. So if you think about in Europe, they rediscovered the kind of Greco-Roman tradition, but that is much smaller. I mean, what has survived is much smaller, right? Some people say 10 times, maybe 100 times more Arabic works have survived than have survived from the Greco-Roman period. So it is in fact even more explosive, the kind of expansion that we have experienced in these 200 years. And when I say 100 times more, that's just, I mean, the Greco-Roman stuff, basically everything has been published that has been found, right? When the US invaded Afghanistan in 2001, they found like one line of Greek that hadn't been known before. Like it was like wow, one line. In Arabic, like the stuff that has been published is only just the peak of the iceberg, right? So it really is an enormously large tradition. And so what it does is it kind of, I mean, it's a different type of tradition, right? Like if you think about it in terms of your short term, I mean, if you think about it in the sense of, there are things that if you think of a tradition as something that is alive in your conversation, right? Something that you remember, or tradition as in the sense of something that is stored away somewhere that you don't actually remember, that you have to actualize, right? So they're like, you can only, like in an oral culture, you can only keep so much information alive, right? While in a written tradition, there's so much that you can just forget for 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, etc. So it is a major influence, and it really is a radical. I mean, that's one of the I wanted to bring out, in the sense of there's this historical idea of modernization is Arabs reading Voltaire translated into Arabic. and everything else is just old stuff, right? Old stuff, it means conservative, whatever. But in fact, much more radical is the stuff like this is because it's authentic, right? It is from you, right? It is from your co-religion. It's written in your language, right? It was maybe written in your country, but it's rediscovered. And so it is much more closer to you. It's much less alien, but still it's new to you. And in that sense, you know, you know, there is a sense of tradition that can be extremely conservative. And we can see this right now in politics, right? There's a type of Islamic conservatism that is deeply and closely allied with political repression, et cetera, right? And that feels threatened as well, like by modernisms, Islamic modernisms, etc. But then there is also a sense of tradition that is kind of the opposite, right? Like all the things that exist there, and so when we think of Europe, you know, as I said, in the 16th century, that's the time of religious change, of intellectual change, of also political upheaval. So these things don't, you know, come at a cost, right? It's not for free. You know, it's not the kind of smooth sailing kind of world. So it is difficult, but it's not something that you can just, and you know, as you said, digitization, you know, I always wonder, I mean, I'm not aware of, you know, I mean, as a researcher, of course, it's amazing that we have these digitized texts and you can just look through them and you can find a lot of things, but to what extent do people read a PDF, for example? Like, how can you read like a 5-volume PDF? Has anybody here read a 5-volume PDF? It's very difficult. Like, it's very difficult to read one book on PDF. My wife can read a book on her phone. I can't do that. So it depends. I don't know, you know, whether the medium itself has a, you know, pushes people towards a less appreciation of long form, right, reading or writing. I have no opinion about this. It certainly makes it available, and that's the amazing thing, right? I mean, even to think that, you know, that people in faraway places, you know, can have access to so many books. That's amazing. But of course, we are also living in a strange world in which, you know, the books that, you know, that we read, they come from a relatively small area of the world, right? I mean, like, you know, what is the last Sudanese author that you've read from Sudan, right? I mean, there's a lot of Sudanese authors in the diaspora that I read, but like Sudanese authors that live in Sudan, it seems like there's a lot of places that clearly have access to works, but we don't kind of see what they're writing or what they're thinking. And I'm not a specialist in it, so I can't really gauge what the effect has been of this, you know, in a sense, democratization of knowledge that happened. But you're absolutely right in saying that you know, at least the capacity has grown. To what extent people actually do, you know, read this, or, you know, whether spend their time on TikTok, I don't know, doing whatever, I don't know. I can't say. I saw a question in the chat by a man called Jonathan Burr. I don't know what Brown. I don't know who that is. Who asked what the origin of the footnote is. There's a good book by Anthony Grafton on the footnote that should tell you the story, but I'm not an expert in it.
Thank you, Professor Ahmed. So I think we'll come to yourself, Dr. Yaqub.
Okay, thank you. Assalamu alaikum. All right, so just bear with me. This is a strange medium for me. All right, so for me, it's just a general comment and observation for everybody, actually, because one of the concerns I have, I mean, I write about the print press myself, is that printing creates a particular visibility for us as academics. It sort of relegates oral tradition as being secondary simply because we can't validate oral tradition. And so what print press does to some degree is it validates the visibility of something which is written in the printed format. What that does is that gives a visibility for someone like Rashid Ridda and Muhammad Abdul, but it creates an invisibility for ulama who are probably giving Jumu'ah khutbahs or circles or talks in the mosques. And what Professor Shamsi just mentioned about Albani is interesting, because the narrative I'm assuming that he mentioned about Albani is an oral tradition narrative. It's not a narrative that you probably find in a book. I could be wrong. That could be something that somebody has written down. But while there was a criticism regarding dream interpretation, which is understandable, but so much of what we understand in regards to context still requires the oral tradition. And what's interesting here is that print was a phenomenon which is very interesting in the Muslim world. And I think it should be seen in totality, in the sense that the print gave us mushafs, the print press gave us constitutions, the print press gave us the majalla, the print press gave us an official form and style of reading. So when you read the works of Rashid Ridda, Ridda is talking about constitutionalism. Ridda is a journalist. Ridda wants to be a parliamentarian. Ridda talks about mushaf printing. Ridda is part of mushaf printing. There's a editing culture, there's a censorship culture, and all of these things are in conversation with one another. And they are not independent from the manuscript culture in that sense. And so the ulama are a communication community in that sense. And they're using new communication strategies as a way of putting information outside. And so in that sense, the real tension in this moment for me, as a historian, as an Ottoman historian, is the way the print press impacts oral tradition. If we look at the Majalla, for example, the Majalla is a direct attack on oral tradition in some ways, because it provides the possibility of codifying Urf tradition into a compact book in which it gives it a particular form of visibility. Now, it's necessary. I understand that as a historian. I understand what's happening. But my concern is, like I said, is that sometimes it's very easy to get access to works of the printing press, and it sort of sometimes misses how print culture in itself facilitated a particular form of synchronization, not necessarily only at the time, but in our minds today, that we make these assumptions of the 19th, 20th century based on the way that we feel right now, because we have access to mediums which are in the print. And what I believe is that maybe, I mean, these print formats were not independent, but were supplementary. They were facilitators, but they were also assisting. And so somehow this is not a critique on the book, because I think the book is not trying to address this point, but this is an address to everyone here, because the line of questions that I'm hearing is to understand what the print culture did, not only for the Arab-speaking world, because I'll give you an anecdote for myself. When I was in Al-Aqsa Library, I asked for some Ottoman works, and the librarian who was there says, "We don't have any Ottoman works." And I turned around and I was annoyed, because I said, "The shelf behind you is Ottoman." And he didn't know. And I said, "Pull it out." And so when we pulled it out, it was Ottoman text. If you read the Mawqif al-Aql of Mustafa Sabri Effendi, if you look at it independently as just works written by an alim, you'll understand it in one way. But if you read his works in the Ottoman newspapers in Ottoman Turkish, he's the parliamentary papers in which he documents his ideas and then writes in Arabic and Ottoman. And then if you take into consideration some of the things he's written by hand, and you look at it in totality, his mawqif can't be seen as independent from his lived experience, right? So sometimes what I've noticed, and this is my case with Ridda as well, is that Ridda had the capacity, for example, in Al-Manar, to make people alive again, because the printed press had the capacity to make Ibn Taymiyyah alive again. And so I think it's not a question per se, but just a comment I'm adding, because sometimes I feel that people are not appreciating how the printed press both facilitated, but also created fissures, because there was an attempt to synchronize. And it's not independent for just manuscript writing, it's across the board, because that's what that phenomena was. Today, we have mushafs in our houses and we can read them. Imagine the only access to Quran you had was going into a mosque and seeing calligraphy on the wall. I mean, that's the phenomena that happened. So that's just the point I wanted to raise in that sense, which is that I think there is a need for a holistic understanding of exactly what the print medium was and how it influenced the Muslim world, both positively and negatively. But, you know, and I want people to understand it in its totality. Thank you very much.
I mean, I totally agree with this. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that we often simplify things. I mean, you know, I've written a book. Why are we talking about it? But I've written the book. Just go and read the book. We don't need to. Why is anybody talking, right? The book is written. But that's how I mean, even if you look at academia, which kind of thinks of itself as mainly a written thing, but people constantly talk to each other, and so the oral and the written always interact with each other constantly, right? And you can't just do you can't just think that it's just one type of interaction, but you can also go back into the manuscript period, Shiraz, like once the madaris are built, you go to Abbasid era Baghdad, when the Nizamiya is built, the ulama suddenly start writing textbooks. Why? Because they want to get professorships. So they write textbooks, right, to recommend themselves to get tenure at the Nizamiya, right? So all of these things, you know, I don't want to say that there's this radical break that happens, and then, you know, we don't understand the preprint world anymore. But at the same time, of course, changes do happen, and it does kind of make a big difference. And one of the strange things of having a copy of a book is that you don't necessarily feel like you have to read it, right? Like one of the functions of buying a book is saying, yeah, I have it on my shelf, I don't need to read it. I have it there, I put it under my pillow, and, you know, like I get it through osmosis. You know, it's not so urgent anymore. Like if there's only one copy somewhere, then, you know, you really have to read it, right? You really need to whatever. So there's all kind of logics that happen and that take place, that one has to keep in mind. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ahmed. Okay, we have several written questions that have been submitted, but just before we come to them, we have Brother Ismail Sayed. Please feel free to pose your question now, inshallah.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you. Can you hear us? Hello?
Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah,
yes,
hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
We can.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's a very great presentation. I just wanted to raise one or two points that was probably touched on passively. That was the oral, the tradition of Ijaza system, text-based. So there was a print version in the classical and also modern era since 18th or 19th century, when there was printing tradition. So at the same time, scholars, they used to go through the Ijaza-based tradition as well, which is an oral. And how did that oral-based, did that complemented or supplemented the text, text preservation, or to help to analyze the text versions? So that's one question. And I wanted to draw this based on my personal experience. And that is when I read Hadith, higher studies in India, Darul Uloom Deoband. So sometimes when we used to read taught Bukhari, so the teachers used to give ijazah at the same time, but sometimes there were discrepancies in the text. And occasionally they used to say, okay, based on my oral ijazah system, which they had it from their teacher, the text should have pronounced it or written this way. This should be the wording. And so therefore, if when you teach others, if there's a discrepancy between the printed one and the one which you had from your ustad or his explanation on the text, the teacher's oral remark will take precedence. Not always, but that is the case. The question when I've asked him how come the printer didn't accommodate those, then they said, well, there are disagreements. So not all teachers, or some teachers have heard differently. So they didn't, it's not accommodated in the text. So this is one question. And related the other question, which you, Professor Shams said, and that is Suyuti, when he was quoting that, he narrated the, quotations from of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal or others, but that was not based on the original text he had in front of him, but he got it from somewhere else, or he heard it from others. How did the professor, I mean, how did you manage to come to this conclusion, meaning that what sources or evidence you've based it up on to conclude that Suyuti did not have the original, or he never even had the book and he just quoted? You may have touched in your book, but it's just that this is the area where I found it a bit difficult to comprehend. That's it. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you very much. I'll try to answer these questions quickly. So the first one on ijaza, I mean, ijaza is a mixed bag. It can mean very different things. To give you an example, the Grand Mufti of Beirut, Nabhani, Imam Nabhani, in the I think 1930 or 1931, gave a general ijaza to all Muslims alive for all of his books. So my father was born in 1930, so I got an ijaza from my father, so I can relate all books from the Nabhani, not having studied with the Nabhani. I've read some of his books, but so there's that kind of ijaza of riwaya that really can have basically no preconditions, right? I mean, there's no, in what sense am I more qualified to transmit the works of a Nabhani than you are? But then there is a more rigorous idea of ijaza, which is generally called the ijaza of tadris, where scholars actually, and we have examples, give like a written permission of somebody saying, okay, I know this person is a solid person, they've studied this text, whatever. So it's much more, in a sense, much more of a degree than having an ijaza which you can get through writing to somebody. You can get an ijaza for your kids, etc. So it's a mixed bag. Just saying somebody has an ijaza doesn't necessarily mean anything. You have to ask further what exactly that consists of. But yes, that is based on a that's a classical idea. On the other issue, so the question of whether Al-Alusi cites At-Tabari directly or cites it through people like a Suyuti, you can find this out. It's a bit, I guess that's why I haven't written it down yet. The methodology is a bit complicated to explain, but especially with modern day databases, you can I mean, Al-Alusi gives hints himself, right? He cites, at least at the beginning, when he cites At-Tabari, he cites him through other people. And then if you look at the entire work, all of the citations are already cited in these other works. So Al-Alusi keeps citing at the beginning of his work, keeps citing either Suyuti or Abu Hayyan, and then later on he just cites Tabari directly. But again, if you look at it, all of these citations are already included in these other works, and so there is no evidence that he had direct access to Tabari, which also makes sense because we look at manuscripts held in Iraq, and there are no manuscripts of Tabari's tafsir in Iraq. So that is kind of what you would expect anyway. Thank you.
Okay, inshallah, let's come to our written questions then. The first question for you, Professor Ahmed, is: do you think that the likes of Abdel Fattah Abu Ghouda and his students have, by their editing efforts, shifted the focus back to the post-classical period?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to, I mean, my book is particularly concerned with the classical period and the works from the classical period. But of course, there are post-classical works that have been edited. A lot of them have been edited in fact, as I say in the book, many of the first editions were in fact post-classical works. But the thing is that there is a limit, like a self-limiting factor of these post-classical works, in the sense that very often they're actually difficult to read. I remember Şükrü Özen, who's a wonderful, great Turkish scholar of classical Islamic law, particularly. He reads the old stuff. He reads Shaybani, whatever, no problem whatsoever. And then I asked him, so what are the texts that are really difficult for you? And he says, like, I have this 19th century Hanafi commentary, and I can't find anybody, not even the old shuyukh, the old Kurdish shuyukh or whatever, shuyukh in Istanbul, who I can read this text. Nobody understands these texts anymore. So these post-classical texts, they are also difficult to understand. And if you, that's really fascinating. Like post-classical Arabic is more difficult to understand than classical Arabic. There is so much more Persian in it. There's, I mean, but also just the syntax of it. It's just, you know, really the kind of modern standard Arabic is much closer to classical Arabic than it is to kind of Arabic 16th century, 17th century Arabic. Try to read these texts; it's much more difficult. So that's part of the story as well, and also part of the parallels, right? To Europe, where kind of medieval Latin these days is very difficult to understand, to read when you studied classical Latin. So there's actually also a linguistic shift that happened. Kind of, you know, the new classical Arabic poets, right? Why are they called like this? It's because they imitated the classic, not just the form of classical Arabic poetry, but also just the language. Yeah.
Okay, our second question is from Alp Eren Topal. My own preliminary research indicates that the very concept of tradition, gelenek in Turkish, is decidedly modern. It is a neologism. Mary Elston's work indicates a similar situation in Arabic. Turath was not a concept until the early 20th century. What words were used in your sources that could be translated as tradition? And what do you think about the modernity of the concept?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously true. You know, you have, I mean, one thing you find is like al-mutaakhirun, al-mutaqaddimun, which is, I mean, in the sense it's closer to kind of classical and post-classical tradition, but the idea of separating us now and saying we are the moderns, and then there's the pre-modern, and that is this heritage, you know, heritage inherit, you know, it's like stuff from my parents. It's not mine, but it's from my parents, so it's related to me, and I have a right to it, and other people don't have a right to it. In that sense, it doesn't connect, right? In that sense, it's a modern concept of relating to old stuff. I mean, there is obviously a sense of you know, the question of how Muslim scholars relate, you know, to the past or relate to other thought. I mean, so to give you an example, like An-Nawawi writes this Tabaqat al-Fuqaha al-Shafi'iyya, or he edits Ibn Salah once, and he publishes it with an introduction, and he says one of the reasons why we need to do this is because so many jurists don't have a sense. So Nawawi writes this in the 13th century of the Common Era. The reason why it's important to write these books is that so many people don't have an idea of who these scholars are that they're talking about. They cite Al-Muzani and they cite Al-Shirazi, and they think they treat them like they're contemporaries to themselves, but it's not true. They lived in different times, they lived in different places. And he says the muhaddithun, they're good at this. They have all, you know, these biographical traditions, but we fuqaha, we treat all these individuals as if they were contemporaries, or there's no time, no sense that they lived in different times and places. So within the Islamic intellectual tradition, there is this awareness among some scholars. Among some scholars there isn't. I mean, you have the same thing in the United States. You look at the US Supreme Court, and they're citing people from 500 years ago as if they're people who live right now, right? I mean, that happens as well. But you know, even within the Islamic tradition, they are aware that this is not just all one soup they are all floating in, but that there's time and change and distance, etc. And you know, it's you know, when you look at people like you know, important people like Al-Dhahabi, for example, you know, everybody thinks, you know, we think about earlier Islamic history through Al-Dhahabi because he's so important in his work. But Al-Dhahabi lived basically halfway, you know, between us and the beginning of Islam. He's like halfway, right? So he's also, when he talks about whatever, Abbasid era, Iraq, whatever, he's also just talking about something way in the past, before him. So this is a long way of saying that, yeah, there's a specific modern taste to the idea of turath, but it's not that pre-modern Muslims had no sense of distance, of historical distance, and how historical distance somehow relates also to kind of possible intellectual distance, or the need to reconstruct things in the past.
Okay, I want to bring in some other people from the audience as well. I can see Dr. Njim, and you want to got your hand up, and also Dr. Umar and Dr. Alex, feel free to come in on any of the points mentioned. Dr. Njim, why don't you start us off, and we'll see how other people want to contribute.
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for your contribution. I'm a very big fan of Ahmed's work in general, but particularly this book, which I think that really does an amazing job. It's a big intervention in our scholarly self-understanding of Islamic studies in general. And I think that it is one of those interventions that changes the angle and provides a new angle from which we can look at what we were doing. So talking about tradition, for example, which over the last few decades has been growing, but to think about materiality of tradition, I think that's a really amazing intervention. Another idea that comes out is that traditions can be closed and open, right? Obviously, I've been thinking about the idea of tradition myself, thought alongside, along with and under the shadow of Talal Asad, who thinks of traditions in a new way, pushes back against Enlightenment bias against tradition as dead. But I always felt that in pushing back against Voltaire, and that understanding of tradition is dead and gone, and therefore all, or Popperian understanding of tradition is just unthinking. Some of our modern and brilliant scholars, thinkers, philosophers like Asad and others almost focus singularly on tradition as a form of argument, as a part, as reason. But for it's important to think that tradition, precisely because it has agency, every new generation recreates tradition, or at least it receives tradition, it can close it or open it, or close and open at the same time in different ways. And I think that having the material history as an ongoing field allows us to critique ourselves in a much more precise way. That not all tradition is the same. The tradition of, for example, that we wear our watch on the left hand, as the example that Popper uses, it's a very different kind of tradition that one finds in Al-Ghazali's refutation of Ibn Sina or his continuation of Al-Shafi'i. And so there's a lot that the word tradition hides, so much so that it almost becomes unhelpful. And I am all for getting rid of that word, because I don't know if it does any useful function anymore. So that said, that's one of the things that I really like about Ahmed's book. I think that it allows us to start thinking about our past much more deliberately. Couple questions that I have, invitations to participate, is first, what happens, right? What happens in 16th, 17th, 18th centuries? I think that, this question, right, must come to our mind. And the reason is that I especially ask somebody who is a Mamlukist or was once a Mamlukist. Mamluk period, in fact, just pre-Ottoman, is remarkably rich in books, remarkably rich in encyclopedic scholars. So before the modern period, the last time when you have encyclopedic scholars, whether it's, Suyuti, before him Ibn Hajar, Ibn Taymiyyah, Al-Dhahabi, Al-Mizzi, and even brilliant original thinkers, Ibn Khaldun, Al-Shatibi, and so on. That period, right, it forces us to add, and they actually had, to address the other question of tradition, they seem to have a very developed understanding of both tradition and history. They were doing history of everything. And so what happens in the Ottoman period, if you will, right? We have Yaqub here to help remind us of it. But I think that's a good challenge for us to think about. Of course, you have Khalid al-Ruwayhib's thesis that nothing happened, really. It's a good old continuity. We've been doing great things. We're doing even greater things in logic works, for example, in this post-classical period. But then you have a critique that develops with the reformists really across the board that something does happen. As Malik bin Nabi says, we became colonizable before we were colonized, right? So this is the most extreme version of this thesis, most clear or crisp, rather, I should say. Well, how did we become colonizable, right? And what do we do with this sensibility? And the second part is the exuberance that one feels that a number of editors, and my only complaint with Ahmed's book is that it's not long enough, it's not longer, because this kind of editorial work is happening not only in Egypt, but also in Hyderabad, India, it's happening elsewhere, and there need to be more books written about that. But you have a really great Ummatics project to connect it to my own interest here and this colloquium and this institute that we have founded, that you really have in this book publishing and a great act of revival happening under our noses that we don't recognize. A great act of ummatic agency where you have a large number of Muslim scholars unknown to us that work over decades in their libraries and dungeons to revive a great tradition, and one that really has so much power today that I dare say that it has great effect on pushing back against Western accounts of modernity, and has a lot more potential. So we do have an act of an ummatic success, like an ummatic agency. And this is often, unfortunately, undermined when we are trying to create a romantic traditional account of late classical period and merely mourning what happens in the modern period, right? So I just wanted to highlight what I thought was just a few things that I thought were great with the book. There's a lot more that I can talk about, so I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Anjem. Professor Ahmed, feel free to come back on that, or if there's any comments from Dr. Omar, Dr. Yaqub, Dr. Alex.
Just as a short idea. I mean, this is in a good question. I mean, like, this is a fascinating question about what happened from the Mamluk period into the later period. And if you think about it, Ibn Khaldun writes the first version of the Muqaddimah when he was still in North Africa, and then he comes to Egypt, and then he adds things about esotericism because that's what he sees in Egypt, right? Like he writes the section about Ibn Arabi in Egypt because he's like, this guy from the West, from where I come from, he's so popular here. And there's all kinds of things like letterism, like where you can assign numbers to letters, and that's the truth of the whatever. And what is that? Like he writes, he's critical of this because that's what he encounters in Egypt. And so that there is, epistemological changes that happen, and that is actually really tectonic change once epistemology changes. And in a sense, you have this in Western academia, right? I mean, you have all these epistemological changes that happen in the last 50 years that change the nature of what scholarship is. and that you can, you can write, I don't know, you can dedicate a career to deconstructing whatever, deconstructing gender in English literature, and that's your contribution. And that what are people in the future going to take from that? Like, what is the intellectual? I mean, it's a very different type of landscape, right? And what is the task? What does it mean to be on the cutting? Like, imagine like every generation has clever people, and let's assume, I mean, I would assume every generation has more or less the same level of intellectual achievement. But what epistemology does, and what kind of intellectual culture does, is it channels, or it tells these people, what is the thing you want to achieve? What is the pinnacle that you can achieve? Where do you go to do this? And what I say in the early chapters of my book is that when you have this idea of, first of all, you have certain sciences like rhetoric and logic become so central in the scholastic realm, then that's what the clever analysis is. And then on the other hand, you have this idea of this sage who doesn't need to read books even, right? And that's where you need to go. If that's the intellectual, if that's what the intellectual culture is, then don't expect people to write original books, because that's not where the people go to, right? If the radical intellectual move in current academia is to show that whatever claim to truth is just veiled power, whatever, then that's what you get from it. And you don't expect people to actually describe reality and get excited about discovering reality. It's all about uncovering agendas and etc. So in that sense, I think there is that is, I mean, as I said, I didn't set out to write something about the pre-modern period. I wanted to write something about the modern period, but I just couldn't avoid or disregard this, because then the story would have been incomplete. But anyway.
Dr. Yaqub, did you want to come in?
Thank you. For me, somebody who's more and more in academia and is uncomfortable being in this space, I've always found it difficult with the typologies and terminologies and definitions and the way that we define people, things, and places and spaces. And the reason why I mentioned that is because we use terms like Mamluk period and Umayyad period, and we don't see the blurring of lines, the transitional moments. That we subscribe Ibn Khaldun to the Mamluk period, and yet Khaldun was well aware of what was happening in the Ottoman domains. I mean, he has an interaction with more than just the Ottomans in that context. And when Selim I comes down to Egypt, and the Egyptian and the Arab provinces become part of the Ottoman domains, one of the questions people always ask, why was the transition as smooth as it was? How is that possible? And it's not only what impact did Istanbul have on Cairo, what impact did Cairo have on Istanbul? And so one of the things that we're trying to do as historians is to try to remove those mental barriers in the sense of still seeing things as nation state frameworks in that sense, and in the sense, seeing the connected history, the connected networks, the connected peoples, the movements that take place in that sense. And the 19th century is interesting for me because we still place ourselves in a worldview in which we are modern, and there's a world that was pre-modern. And so we subscribe ourselves to the introduction of modernity as a construct, as an idea, and we frame ourselves within that worldview of belonging to the 19th century onwards in anything prior to that. So we ourselves in our minds have constructed a world in our heads in the way that historians have, of a world which is modern and a world which is not. And that's not helpful, because the 19th century is still a very different world than it is today. It's a world of imperial empires. It's a world of empires, of Muslim sovereign empires, which are very connected. It's a world of movement of scholars in a way that's unprecedented at one point in Islamic scholarship. I mean, I started to write the biography of Mustafa Sabri and I gave up, because how do you write, or how do I write a life of a person who was born in Tokat, lives in Istanbul, moves to Greece, moves to Romania, goes to Beirut and dies in Egypt? How do you make sense of that? And the point I'm trying to make is sometimes when works are just Arabic scholars or Ottoman and so forth, there's a restriction, and those boundaries need to break down as a way of trying to understand exactly the flow of ideas. Ideas transcend spaces, they transcend boundaries, and people take ideas with them in ways which are very difficult to sometimes make sense of. And the problem is that written text gives you the impression that that source is restricted to a particular space. In my own work regarding constitutionalism, I have 0 works written in Albanian that talk about constitutionalism. And yet when the constitutional revolution was happening, they were saying the same things that were being said in Egypt. How is that possible? Because ideas are moving, they're traveling. And although I don't have the physical text, one would assume that people are moving, people are speaking, people are interacting. So for me, my concern is, and it's the practical concern, that there needs to be a movement away of so many of the typologies that have been created both in Western academia and in our own tradition to some degree, and I'm using the word tradition here, as a way of maybe seeing the blurring of lines. Where are the blurring of spaces and lines taking place to understand things better? Because for me right now, I don't even know how to make sense of what I am. What period are you going to place me in? What country are you going to put me in? I was born in London. I live in Turkey, and now I'm in Tokyo. Like, how does that work? And you know, how do ideas transcend to other cultures? Like, one of the things that I've noticed in the Ottoman constitutional period is the idea of Islam in the Ottoman constitutional period had impact on Shintoism and Confucianism in China. How does that happen, right? And that's part of missing people's imagination. So one of the things I want to see in the scholarship is the recognition of the blurring of lines, the blurring of spaces, the blurring of people, the blurring of periods. And only then, I think, can we have a better grasp of, now that's hard to do as an academic because you need typology to define things. And so the reason why I say this is because when Ovami mentioned before, I don't like the word tradition, but still it's so deeply entrenched that how do you describe something without using a word which has a particular understanding for its readership? You would have to educate your readership to move away from that. And that's very difficult to do in some sense. So for example, for me, Muslims always attack me for using the word Ottoman Empire. But I mean, how do I move away from the word empire? Because of the way they understand it. And so some of these words might be harder. So I guess in some ways I'm contradicting myself, but what I'm trying to say is, on the one hand, there needs to be a serious investment in how typologies are problematizing some of these things that we're looking at. But on the other hand, removing typologies creates another set of problems. But that's just my thought process.
Dr. Amr, did you want to come in, or any of the other panelists to respond on that?
Yeah, I mean, not a response to this, but going back to what Awaimer said, I mean, you can make these comparisons in pretty concrete ways. So, you know, compare any of these late Mamluk encyclopedists you mentioned to, you know, the greatest of the Ottoman encyclopedists, Katib Chalabi, for example, and you get a sense of how, you know, they're moving in very different scholarly terrain. And yeah, but you know, a detailed comparison is obviously not a work I'm able to do.
Okay, inshallah. We have a couple of other written questions that have been submitted. Again, though, if anybody wants to come in on any particular point, just put your hand up. Inshallah, we can revert back to that. Our next question was submitted anonymously. To what extent did the problem of access to important texts, as was mentioned in the example of Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida, contribute to the rise of modernism? Professor Ahmed?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I mean, in my book, I talk about the importance of the foundation of modern libraries, which is really I mean, modern libraries in the Arab world were founded on the basis of Western libraries. Not because they didn't have libraries there, but because I'm going to use that dreaded verb here, because these libraries had declined, right? There was a decline in traditional libraries, awqaf libraries, madrasa libraries. Many of them had ceased to function as libraries. These endowed libraries, where the endowments had lapsed, and where you just couldn't see the books, right? If you imagine you're in the 19th century Egypt, and the librarian still gets the salary from the Ottoman waqf that was instituted in the 18th century, right? 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago. So the salary is nothing, right? It's like the librarian comes in 1 hour a week or something like this. So these modernists say, well, we need to have access. I mean, like, we don't have many books, and the books that we have, we can't access, right? We need to have access to these books, and we need to, to have them properly cataloged. So, if we have them in the building, we know how to find them. And we need to have printed catalogs of libraries, so that if they're not in our library, we can find them in another library. So it's basically an issue of access, right? These days we are used to just Googling something, and then we suddenly have everything, the knowledge of the world in our fingertips. But just like finding stuff, I mean, if you don't know where it is, then you can spend your whole life just trying to find things. So part of this, I mean, these are all things connected, but you want to be able to access knowledge. You go to Paris, you see the Bibliothèque Nationale, or you go to Western libraries and you say, oh, look, it's easy. You can go in there, they have a catalog. It's easy, like it takes 2 minutes and you find all the books. Why is that not the case in our library? We have whatever 80 libraries, and most of them, you spend a month just trying to catch the librarian for the kind of 1 hour opening a day or a week or whatever. So this thirst for books is also a thirst for access, and so that there is the modernization of library, and again, these libraries are also state projects. So it's the idea that we are a modern state, we need to have access to knowledge available to everybody, to every citizen, etc. So all of these things, the foundation of modern libraries, the way that the states they break the endowments, right? They violate endowments of madrasas and endowed libraries, and say, okay, well, the original purpose of these endowed libraries was to make knowledge accessible. They don't do this anymore, so we'll just by force take those manuscripts and put them all together in our central library. So that is an important story of the, that's why I don't want to say it's just about, my book is just about print. Print is obviously central and an important part of it, but there is about, making knowledge available is probably the better, or the more general term for that process.
Any other thoughts on that? Anybody wish to come in on that? Okay, no, all right. We've got two further written questions that we'll get to, inshallah. The first is from Ash for you, Professor Ahmed. The rise of the printing press in the Muslim world has had its effects on the production of scholarship and mainstreaming it. Do you see the digital nature of today's world having any sort of similar effects on the production of scholarship or the editing of traditional works? Going back to, I think it was Brother Yahya Bertz who raised a similar point.
I mean, it's difficult, mainstream, it's like, you look at news, okay? So, people in my age, when you grew up, there were like 2, 3 TV channels. And so there was a mainstream news that everybody watched, right? Now, everybody, makes their own news, right? Oh, I saw something on Twitter. Oh, I saw some crazy website, whatever. So it's like there's no mainstream news anymore, right? It's just, news. And in the same sense, that there is that challenge is also for the Islamic written tradition, right? So you have manuscripts. I don't know. You look for Arabic manuscripts, you can find some text that somebody digitized in Yemen, or digitized in Malaysia, or in Bosnia or something like this, and then maybe like, okay, well, maybe I edit it. And the interesting thing is that I mean, part of the Arab-speaking world, part of the problem there is that you don't have many good journals. But a lot of actually good research is published online, like in chat forums and whatever, stuff that is even difficult to cite sometimes as an academic. But a lot of, there are a lot of good people there. But in fact, I have encountered criticisms by Western scholars when I cite Arabic scholarship, because they say, oh, well, they don't have peer review, or, that wasn't published in a scholarly journal and whatever. It's like, well, there's a question of access, right? So there is a lot of work produced, some stuff obviously bad, sometimes some stuff very good, and the ability to do this has obviously increased. There's no question about it. But as with everything, when you increase things, there's also more chaff. It's also and in that sense, that's the challenge of modernity, is that you just don't have, you have less and less handholds, less and less things to tell you what is the mainstream, what is the what is the marginal thing. And that's one of the challenges in approaching this.
Dr. Yusuf?
It's interesting when I watch sometimes, or asked to watch videos on YouTube of scholars speaking, and you say that's oral tradition recorded. That's interesting, because in the past, when you spoke words, they just disappeared. That's the power of writing. Writing was that you could document something, put it down, and it had a level of authority and power because it had longevity, because it, the test of time was that it was written down. Whereas now you have somebody coming on YouTube, Speaker's Corner, whatever, speaking, the video is recorded, and now that has the capacity to stick around in the same way as written text has the ability to stick around, right? And in that sense, you can see a sort of like revival of the vernacular to some degree on YouTube by people who may not be experts. And this is my point, is the issue of expertise. These manuscripts and libraries and books, we need to remember, were for a specific group of people. The mass would not engage with these spaces, nor were they interested in it. Usually, the way that the mass would interact with these ideas, like I remember the Ottoman newspapers, the way that the Ottoman newspapers were written was that somebody would take a newspaper, go into a coffee shop and read it to everybody. And everyone would sit there, drink their coffee and listen. Or somebody would bring a newspaper, walk into a mosque and read it to them. And then people would debate it over. By and large, books that were written down, even printed and collected, were not for everybody. It's an elite group of people who read elite types of books. So I have the assumption that if I ever publish, my book's going to collect dust, or there's going to be a few group of people who would read it, because it's just not in a language which appeals to the mass Muslim audience. What that indicates to me is that even today, where there's a higher literacy rate today than there was in the past, the gap between those who write expert works and the gap between the rest of society is still large. The #1 selling book will probably be on life, how to improve your life, 20 ways of becoming a better human being, 15 ways of making money. That's the book that people read. They're not going to read my work on Ottoman history. So the point I'm trying to make is, even though there's an increased level of literacy now, the gap between the expert and the mass is still the same. It hasn't changed. And the assumption we need to, I guess, break down is the idea that in those days, because it's maybe not as much of a literacy gap space regarding the masses, that somehow there's a level of illiteracy amongst people. People are still very literate. They're intelligent. They understand ideas, but the communication tool is different. And what scholars understood in terms of libraries and so forth, because Ahmed talks about the states taking over. I mean, there are instances where the ulama themselves built their own libraries, like the Khalidiyya library is an example of that in Palestine, where the ulama recognized that they want independent libraries for themselves. And this is an ulama-led project in some ways. And the way that the ulama understand it is that they need to be part of the state structure to be able to use the tools of the state to safeguard ilm by being able to safeguard these libraries. So they didn't actually leave it to the state itself. They actually become amalgamated within the state institutions as a way of then safeguarding these libraries and so forth. This is important to understand that, because sometimes there's an assumption that the state came after the madrasa and the ilmiya institutions, and then they just disappeared. But actually the ulama found a way of recycling themselves and going into these state institutions as a way of safeguarding this. So it's still very interesting in the way it operates. And I think, you know, I just want people to have that in their mind, that that's how it actually functions and works. And today's digital age may put out a lot of nonsense out there, but in the end of the day, real scholarship is still going to be in the hands of the few. The real thinkers are still going to be the few. The real revolutionary ideologues are still going to be the few. And it's the way that they have the capacity to then propagate those ideas out to the many in the various mediums available, which becomes important. And I think, you know, a lot of times there's an expectancy that scholars should come on YouTube and podcasts and so forth as a way of speaking to the mass. Because you know, there is a lag somewhere, but this is something we need to consider in terms of doing works amongst ourselves and then speaking to the mass in a medium that works for them. And that's been done all the time. The Jummah khutbah was exactly that.
Interesting. Thank you, Dr. Yaqub. Okay, we have one last question, I think, before we'll wrap up. It's a question for you, Professor Ahmed, but it hopefully isn't going to be too long. It's from Brother Ismail Sayyid, who asked this question earlier. Since you last wrote your book, Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, has any of your arguments or thinking changed?
I mean, there's always the more one reads, the more one I mean, if I had said nothing has changed, that would only show that I haven't thought or I haven't read anything since then. So there's a lot I would write differently now, or I would add to it. There is obviously the perennial problem of you know, whenever you speak, whenever you say something, whenever you write something, people understand it within their own framework, and it's kind of you know, they don't necessarily understand it the way that you intended it to be understood. So in that sense, I you know, if I were to write it again, I would write it maybe differently. But in terms of the overall arguments, I have not. You know, maybe just the selection bias in the sense that you just take on the information that already confirms what you thought before. But I have not come across kind of fundamental points that would say, oh yes, I mean, I really kind of should restructure my argument, or my argument wasn't correct in that sense. There are individual things. I mean, there's a paperback version of my book that's going to be published later this year, where I incorporate corrections that people have made who generously, you know, read my book and criticized it. So, you know, when there are things, you know, that you find, I'd be happy to hear them and to hopefully incorporate them if it gets republished again in the future. But overall, no.
Okay, alhamdulillah. I think that's a good note to leave on, because inshallah we will end the discussion portion of today's event here. But just before we close, inshallah, I'll hand over to Dr. Anjem for some closing remarks and a bit about the Ummatics project.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you very much, everyone, once again for joining. I want to simply end very briefly with an invitation to everyone here to join the Ummatics Institute, our forthcoming institute that carries on the work and expands the work that this colloquium, Ummatics Colloquium, has started. We are an institution that is interested in cultivating Islamic discourse centered on the question and the quest rather for unification of the Muslim world, a comprehensive unification. And we believe that the most important task is that Muslims should be able to think as an ummah, recover the agency as an ummah, and that starts really in fact, I'll link this to the comment Ahmed made earlier on the epistemological sea change that I believe has taken place in the 20th century and is taking place. And it's a kind of epistemological change that perhaps can allow us to think as agents that are interested in, propelled as Muslims qua Muslims, to think and act, and are able to dream, are able to have visions that we can in fact think about the world, not merely as reactionaries or conservatives, but as agents, that we can undertake projects of unification, project of thinking together, project of helping each other, the poor and the disadvantaged among us. All of this is connected to really this epistemological anchor, and that's where we want to make a difference, right? So the Ummatics is a discourse, it's a set of practices, and it's an institution, it's a think tank, and a discipline that we want to cultivate. For that purpose, we invite you all, if you haven't joined the Institute, please visit us at ummaticscolloquium.org. Very soon, in the next couple of months, we'll be launching the Institute website, and we are looking for researchers, we are looking for writers, and we are looking for people to provide us feedback in a broad swathe of areas and scholarship. If you are interested, visit our website where we talk about the different areas that we are seeking to expand. Thank you very much, everyone, again, for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Anjem, and again, thank you to all of our speakers and all of our attendees, everybody who's here today, for participating in the conversation. Alhamdulillah, it was a very productive conversation. Before we go, I'd like to as well encourage everybody to subscribe to our email newsletter if they haven't already, in order to receive updates about our upcoming colloquiums. We have another colloquium coming up at the end of this month, actually. Dr. Jonathan Lawrence will be presenting a paper based on his recent book, Coping with Defeat. So be sure to register for that and for future updates. Other than that, please keep updated with our upcoming articles. And as Dr. Anjem said, look out for the Institute's website, inshallah, later this month as well. You can also subscribe to our social media and, as I said, the Colloquium newsletter as well, and get those updates directly to your inbox or Facebook or Twitter. So until next time, inshallah, thank you again from us. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.